55 kilometers from the battlefield of Kili, Zafar Khan turned his head to look back, and his heart nearly stopped when he realized that after chasing the Mongol forces across empty fields, he had only 1,000 exhausted cavalry left, while ahead the Hijlak unit was turning around with a sinister smile. Behind him, the Targi unit had silently surrounded and blocked every route back to Delhi. He looked toward the distant capital, desperately searching for any sign of reinforcements, but there was nothing except empty fields and terrifying silence. In that moment, Zafar Khan understood he had fallen for the trap of feigned retreat, the most classic Mongol tactic, the maneuver that had killed hundreds of thousands of enemies from China to Europe. Meanwhile, at Kili, just 10 kilometers from Delhi, a messenger rode back to bring Alauddin and Khilji news of this disaster. Officers shouted, "Send troops to rescue him now!" But the king just stood still in tense silence. He looked ahead to where 60,000 Mongol cavalry were facing 700 Delhi elephants like living walls, with the swift-flowing Yamuna River on one side and dense jungle brush on the other. Now he had to make the hardest decision of his life: save a talented general but ruin the entire plan, or sacrifice him to preserve the perfect trap he had painstakingly built. In the next few hours, everything would change forever. One decision would shape history, and a secret weapon no one expected would be revealed. So like this video right now, and subscribe to the channel to see how this story ends. Alauddin Khilji looked at the map on the table with lines marking Zafar Khan's position 55 kilometers to the north. After a silence so long that the officers around him began to feel suffocated, he said only one word: "No." His voice was cold, emotionless. When an officer dared to object, "But Zafar Khan is our most talented general." Alauddin turned to look at him with eyes sharp as knives and replied, "He violated my orders. He chose his own fate." Then he continued, "No one leaves their position. Hold formation. We wait." 55 kilometers to the north, Zafar Khan had realized he had no reinforcements, that he had been betrayed by the very king he was loyal to. But instead of surrendering, he drew his sword and shouted, "For honor!" before charging into the final battle of his life with courage, so great that even his enemies had to admire him. 1,000 Delhi cavalrymen fought against more than 10,000 Mongols in a death battle with no chance of winning. Zafar was like a ferocious lion, killing dozens of enemies until his sword broke, and he had to fight with his bare hands. Blood fell like rain on the battlefield, his body covered in deep wounds. But he never stopped fighting until he finally collapsed on his knees, exhausted with his last breath. Kutlug Khwaja, the 25-year-old prince of the Chagatai Empire, walked up to Zafar Khan and looked down at the general lying in a pool of blood with admiring eyes. Then he spoke words that history would remember. "You are a great warrior. Come with me. I will make you a king." It was an offer of power from the very enemy who was winning. But Zafar used his last strength to lift his head, smiled bitterly, and whispered, "I am loyal to the Sultan who betrayed me." This answer made Kutlug fall silent for a long moment, then nod respectfully before ordering, "Execute him." But just before the sword came down, Zafar's last 50 guards charged in one final desperate attempt to save their master. They created a fierce melee among hundreds of men. In that chaos, a stray spear struck deep into Kutlug Khwaja's side, causing the prince to fall with blood flowing freely. Although Zafar Khan's head was still cut off in that melee, Kutlug's wound would become infected and kill him just days later. The tragic death of a betrayed general had become a fatal blow to the entire Mongol Empire. News of the prince's injury spread like wildfire back to the main battlefield at Kili. 60,000 Mongol cavalry began to waver as they looked at the 700 Delhi elephants still standing there like invincible fortresses. They looked at the wide, swift-flowing Yamuna River that couldn't be crossed, and looked at the dense tropical jungle that couldn't be circled around. When they checked their food supplies and found only enough for 1 or 2 more days after 6 months marching from Central Asia, they began to feel something the Mongol Empire had never known: despair. On the third night, Kutlug Khwaja lay in his tent with a high fever and the wound becoming increasingly infected. He looked at the battlefield map with fading eyes and finally understood a painful truth. They weren't losing because of a lack of courage or inferior weapons, but because of terrain. Terrain is something that cannot be conquered with swords or arrows. With a weak voice, he made the most painful decision in Mongol Empire history. Retreat. 60,000 cavalry retreated in the darkness northward without Alauddin pursuing them. This wise king knew that letting them go safely was better than risking an unnecessary battle. On the way back to Central Asia, Kutlug Khwaja died of infection at 25. He didn't die from losing in combat, but from a random wound in a needless skirmish. Alauddin returned to Delhi without holding celebrations, without praising Zafar Khan, even erasing his name from official histories out of jealousy of his fame. But the people still remembered Zafar as a tragic hero who died from loyalty to the one who betrayed him. But how could 60,000 invincible Mongol cavalry lose like this without any decisive battle? What was the secret weapon Alauddin Khilji really used? To understand that, we must go back to spring 1299, when Dua Khan of the Chagatai Khanate ordered his son Kutlug Khwaja on a mission completely different from previous raids: conquer and rule Delhi as they had done in China, Persia, and Russia. The reason was that the Mongol Empire had split into 4 Khanates, and Chagatai was caught in the middle, making the only direction for expansion south into wealthy India. 60,000 elite cavalry marched for 6 months with a smart strategy. Don't raid cities, don't destroy fortresses, and avoid all battles to conserve strength for Delhi. When they reached Keli in November, just 10 kilometers from the capital, they arrogantly rejected Zafar Khan's invitation to battle with the phrase, "Kings only fight kings." It was a confidence that seemed justified because they'd never met a worthy opponent. Meanwhile, Delhi was in a state of panic. People from everywhere fled into the city seeking shelter. Prices skyrocketed, and advisors all urged Alauddin to pay ransom instead of taking risks. But he refused, saying, "If I show weakness, who will still respect me?" Despite having only 1 or 2 weeks to prepare, and the main army being in Gujarat, the reason was that he had a plan no one expected. The first 2 days, the 2 armies only faced each other in silence, with neither attacking. The Mongols waited for Alauddin to come out, while Alauddin just stood there waiting. On the morning of the 3rd day, when Alauddin summoned his officers and ordered, "No one leaves their position, violators will be beheaded," Zafar Khan nodded in compliance. But his eyes were still full of eagerness to fight. When the Hijlak unit appeared, he made the deadliest mistake of his life. Everyone thought elephants were Alauddin's weapon, but they were completely wrong. Elephants were just tools. The real weapon was the terrain of Kili itself, a perfect natural trap with the wide, swift-flowing Yamuna River on one side that no cavalry could cross. Dense tropical jungle on the other blocking all horse movement, and in the middle a narrow strip of land, only a few kilometers wide, where Mongol strength became completely useless. You see, the Mongols' entire military career was built on space. They needed vast steppes to maneuver lightning fast, to surround enemies from all directions, and especially to execute feigned retreats as they did with Zafar Khan. But at Kili, they were compressed between river and forest like a lion trapped in a cage. That lion still had sharp claws and powerful jaws, but on cramped ground, it was just an ordinary animal unable to hunt. Delhi's 700 elephants, standing 3 to 4 meters tall and weighing 4 to 5 tons, were deployed 22 per division. On a wide steppe, elephants would be slow and easy to dodge, but on Kili's narrow strip, they became impassable living walls. When Mongol horses saw those giant masses of flesh in a confined space with no escape route, their survival instinct caused them absolute panic and complete paralysis. On top of that, Kili was only 10 kilometers from Delhi, meaning Alauddin could supply fresh provisions daily for elephants and troops. Meanwhile, the Mongols had traveled 6 months from Central Asia, thousands of kilometers away, and each day of waiting was a day they grew weaker. Alauddin's plan wasn't to defeat them in battle, but to keep them in the trap long enough for terrain and time to kill them. That's why he gave strict orders that no one could leave their position. When Zafar violated that order, he sacrificed Zafar to preserve the entire plan. Now I want you to comment and tell me, was Alauddin right or wrong to do that? And this is where I have to be honest with you. Many people say the Mongols defeated themselves through mistakes, but I completely disagree with that view. They didn't lose because they were weak or stupid, but because all 3 pillars of their tactics, mobility, encirclement, and feigned retreat, became completely useless at Kili. It's like taking away an eagle's ability to fly and expecting it to still fight effectively on the ground. If we compare to history, Leonidas at Thermopylae used a narrow mountain pass to block Persia, and Hannibal at Cannae used an army formation to encircle Rome. But Alauddin at Kili did something more subtle. He used nature itself to turn terrain into a giant cage, not maneuvering armies to defeat the enemy, but to make the enemy defeat themselves. I have to say that although Alauddin was a brutal man who killed his uncle to seize the throne, trampled prisoners with elephants, and erased Zafar Khan's name out of jealousy, I still admire his strategic genius. Because he understood something many other great generals didn't realize. War isn't about morality or honor, it's only about winning. And he won by making nature his strongest ally. After the Battle of Kili, the Mongols returned to attack Delhi in 1303, 1305, and 1306, but all failed because their aura of invincibility had been permanently shattered. They learned the costly lesson not to fight where they had no advantage in space and terrain. That's precisely why India was never completely conquered by the Mongols like China or Persia. So when you think about 1299 at Kili, remember that whoever chooses the battlefield is often more important than whoever has the strongest army. 60,000 Mongol cavalry lost not because they were weak, but because they fought on ground that wasn't theirs. Sometimes the best weapon isn't steel or fire, but the very terrain beneath your feet. If you know how to use it, even the most invincible empire can be trapped in a cage. Comment and let me know. In modern warfare with planes and missiles, does terrain still matter? And subscribe to the channel to see more deep historical analysis like this, because history isn't just the past, but lessons for our future.